We have now Max Blumenthal and Glenn Diesen. Glenn is super in choosing and can choose in what way he can include Max into this, because Glenn is going to talk about a topic that he... Feel free to come, Glenn. He's the Norwegian expert in the relationship between Europe and Asia, the Eurasia question. And those who follow him, and there are thousands, not to say hundreds of thousands of people following him internationally. And he's a man who is not being unpunished. A lot of people want to remove him as a professor, because sometimes truth is more frightening than even the lies we often talk about. Glenn, the floor is yours. And I know that you have discussed it with the people when to and how to include Max. Max is waiting for us somewhere up there, as they used to say, no?
Well, I think it's going to log in about 10 minutes, so okay. I'll just do something brief and then we'll bring him on.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, I know I have a headpiece, so I'm good. So, yeah, you're going to have to be a little bit patient, and yeah, Max Blumenthal will join us very soon. In the meanwhile, I want to talk about a topic which might be a bit dry and, well, even boring, but it's quite relevant, I think, which is the demise of international law. Because there is an interesting phenomenon which has occurred over the past years, which is that international law has been gradually replaced by what we call the rules-based international order. Now, these are often treated as synonyms, so we can hear them being used over each other. People switch back and forth as if they would mean the same thing. But this is not merely an issue of semantics, it is very different concepts, and they reflect also why international law has been in decline. So just to flesh out these two different concepts, international law, as we know, established under the UN Charter after World War II, was set up during a time when there was several centers of power, then primarily the US and the Soviet Union. And in such a system, the main powers would want some constraint. That is, they're willing to have some constraint on themselves, because in return, you get reciprocity and thus predictability. So in such a system, under international law, we have sovereign equality. That is, all states should have the same sovereignty. No one should interfere in the affairs of others, just as others shouldn't interfere in your affairs. And everyone has the same restraint on military force, etc. Now, the rules-based international order is something very different, because this was born after the Cold War and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That is, it was one center of power, and as we know from political realism, states don't tend to balance themselves. So when there's only one center of power, no one constrains it, and this also reflects what laws and rules are supposed to achieve. Why would a hegemon, and this is what the US set out to do, to create what they consider to be a hegemonic peace, at least an international system based on US global dominance. But in such a system, there's no acceptance for this principle that that the US should restrain itself, or indeed that the US should have the same sovereignty as other states. If you're going to rule an international system, then obviously you need full sovereignty, you and your partners, while the rest of the international system needs limited sovereignty. So suddenly, this is the core of why the international law versus the rules-based international order are so very different. International law is sovereign equality, while the rules-based international system is based on sovereign inequality. Now, when the international rules-based system began to develop, it was sold to the public as merely being international law plus humanitarian law. But it still begs the question, does this add or does it compete? Because I argue it created two competing sets of rules. That is, in international law, we say you can't interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries. While under the international rules-based order, we say, well, unless you're a liberal democracy, then you can promote democracy inside other countries. Or at least, as we'll learn now from USAID, you can finance their NGOs, mobilize their civil society, you can finance their media. So again, this is okay. Obviously, this would never be permitted if the Chinese would do it in the United States, but it's a one-way thing. It's sovereign inequality. In international law, we say you can't use military force except for in self-defense. In the international rules-based order, we have humanitarian interventions. So again, one side has the right to violate sovereignty. One can exempt itself from international law by claiming to act in the interest of human rights. Obviously, this is what NATO always points towards when it's bombing another country. However, it's not acceptable, obviously, if the Chinese, Russians, or any other country would, or parts of the world, especially American adversaries, would refer to human rights as a reason to bomb another country. So again, this is also where international law and the international rules-based order are very different. Then we also have secessionism. In international law, we're quite explicit. Territorial integrity and sovereignty of the state is an absolute, so we don't accept any secession without the permission of that country. However, in the international rules-based order, we accept self-determination to the extent, the liberal democracies, so that is the United States, approves it. This is why we end up with different situations. In Kosovo, yes, we need self-determination, so they should secede from Serbia. If it's allies such as Spain, obviously not. Crimea also doesn't matter how many people want to secede. This is still territorial integrity and sovereignty that should be picked. And with the wars from Syria to Iraq, there was always the same discussions in the United States, whether or not should balkanize the region, just split them up to different states. So again, at these instances, territorial integrity is not an absolute anymore. While, of course, we could continue looking to Taiwan. Here, obviously, self-determination should be the leading principles. So one starts to see a tendency that this is determined very much by power, but always legitimized by liberal democracy. Because again, who gets to pick whether or not we go with international law or the rules-based international order? It tends to be, again, the hegemon who doesn't constrain itself and is always legitimized by acting in the interest of humanitarian law. But nonetheless, we end up with a system where promoting democracy, humanitarian intervention, secession, all of this is legitimized by the same slogans. And I guess what's become quite unique, especially with this genocide in Gaza, is one starts to question, well, one should at least question, to what extent the Western countries have acted actually in the interest of human rights, because there's always been at least some area to hide and to make up excuses, but of course this time is very different. But still, I wanted to spend just a brief time talking about how we got to this point, because as I said, it really began after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as we then had an international legal system based on mutual constraint, and we wanted to replace it with one based on sovereign inequality. So no constraint on us, but constraint on others. So Yugoslavia really became the first instance with the attack on Yugoslavia in 1999. This was declared to be not legal, but legitimate. Now, this is an interesting framing, because this is really the first time we decouple legitimacy from legality. And what makes it legitimate, and while not perhaps being legal? Well, it's the liberal democratic ideals. So we said, well, human rights, democracy, now we can invade, now we can sever that territory. And again, the main logic or the main rhetoric at the time, as we remember, was, the Russians, the Chinese, these people don't understand and care about human rights, so obviously they shouldn't have a veto in the UN Security Council. And And this is really the core of this rules-based international order. That is, we have legitimacy which exempts us from international law. And it's all premised on this idea that we're acting in the interest of humanity. And then we saw this develop even further. In Iraq, the United States, they began, and as well as NATO, by the way, began to talk about an alliance of democracies. The argument was that the United Nations, it had countries in it which didn't care that much about our liberal democratic values, and we needed an alternative source of legitimacy to act in the interest of humanity. So we had the alliance of democracies. Some spoke of the concert of democracies. Others spoke of the League of Democracies. Again, one tends to see where this is going. And it's the main principle here is a universalism defended by the West. So liberal democracy should be the key principle. The West is the champion of liberal democracy. Thus, we made liberal democracy indistinguishable from Western hegemony. And the main idea was one set of rules for us and another one for them. And earlier on, we heard talking about the garden versus the jungle. Again, this was the colonial language we had, with the garden being the civilized world and the jungle being the areas for the barbarians. And in the 1990s, there was an argument that we should really start to rethink the benefits of the colonial era, because this was a time, because the garden now is under attack. This is, by the way, a language also the EU uses now, that the jungle is getting too big. It's really starting to grow into the garden. It's time to go out and trim the jungle a bit and protect the garden. And interesting, much of the rhetoric in the 90s obviously came from Tony Blair, and his one of his key advisors, Robert Cooper, even called for reviving liberal empire and imperialism, in which he argued that, quote, among ourselves we keep the law, but when we are operating in the jungle, we must use the law of the jungle. We need to revert to the rougher methods of an earlier era. Force, preemptive attack, deception, whatever is necessary to deal with those who still live in the 19th century world. So here in the West, we still live in the jungle, but when we enter this, we live in a garden, but when we enter the jungle, obviously the same rules should not apply, and one can do almost what one desires. And this also goes back really to the idea, for those who have read George Orwell's Animal Farm, this at the end, when the new painting has appeared on the barn door, where it says all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This is really the rules-based international order. This is that all states are equal, but some states are more equal than others. And this is also why I think that the international rules-based order is coming to an end, because it's not really international anymore. It's not rules-based. No one actually told anyone what the rules were. And there's no order. Obviously, this does not deliver order at all, which is why the world majority is moving strongly against this and calling for a return to international law. And the hegemon is gone, which created the incentives for this system to begin with. And furthermore, the legitimacy of the whole system has collapsed. And I think that the genocide in Gaza really is the final tombstone for this rules-based international order, in which this legitimacy is obviously gone. So, thank you.